Hey everyone, so I didn't expect to make this video here today, but the great Patrick Bartley recently dropped a video that I'm sure some of you guys are already aware of, where he breaks down a sort of tier list that essentially ranks the usefulness and functionality of a lot of the main chords that we find in jazz that could apply to what he describes as the current meta of jazz harmony for competitive play, and I'm going to link this video in the description. Usually, I don't like the idea of making a video about another video and just riding the coattails of its potential success, but I honestly found this video to be extremely intriguing, insightful, and undeniably unique in regards to contributing to the canon of the entire education of jazz harmony. And I feel it's something worth promoting and possibly contributing to the discussion of. So first, I just want to give a disclaimer to my viewers because this video is going to be all about harmony, and one of the things that I really like about Patrick's video is when he talks about all this stuff and he does it in such a practical way. He doesn't baby the stuff that he says at all. He just kind of assumes that his audience knows what he's talking about. This is not necessarily for beginners. If you're watching my videos, you may be at different levels. You may not understand everything that he talks about in his video or what I may possibly say today, but don't worry about that if this is over your head at all. This is extra content anyway. This is all insightful stuff, but, don't feel threatened if you're confused by any of this. I did make a list of some of my thoughts that I wanted to say here, but a lot of these ideas are kind of all interconnected to each other, and there's a good chance that this may come out a little scatterbrained today anyway, or, I might forget some of the things because he says so much, and even him, I'm sure, there's so many more things that he could have said in his video. It's just kind of impossible to get to everything, but just take what you can from this. I also figured I'd let you guys know that the first couple minutes of this right now are going to be more so like big picture kinds of ideas or thoughts that I guess I could say were inspired by Patrick's video, but in the end, even I can admit, I think this turned out extremely rambly and perhaps a little over-analytical, which can oftentimes be the case when it comes to discussions on harmony. I'm even going off on Counterpoint at one moment during this. You might be thinking, like, what does this have to do with this video? But just bear with me. I promise you, I am still definitely going to be getting to actual specific things from Patrick's video that he may have said or certain chords on his tier list. And if you only care about that, you can skip ahead to whatever time comes up on the screen right now. But, it was pretty exhausting making this video in actuality. I didn't expect it to really go like this. I thought it would be a cool idea at first. I wanted to get this out a lot sooner than it ended up coming out. But, just bear with me and hope you guys enjoy. So here's the thing. Although I ultimately can now really appreciate what Patrick has done with this video here, my initial reaction to it was definitely a little different, and at first I was thinking more along the lines of something like, wait a minute, what's going on here? What exactly is he really trying to say with all this stuff?
Wait, what the what?
But truth be told, I've watched this video in its entirety already, probably something like 4 to 5 times, so obviously it still made enough of an initial impact on me to want to keep thinking about it or even watch it again. I could already understand and largely agree with pretty much all the stuff that he said throughout the video. I thought it was all good information, but I think the reason why I was still left scratching my head at first was honestly because I kind of felt like, what's the point of this still? Like, why is it helpful to rank these chords in this order and to be aware of this? Assuming you already knew about all these chords and, all the information he was talking about was not like brand new to you, because if it is, then of course, this video could teach you a lot. It's really like a semester's worth of jazz harmony education packed into hour-and-a-half long video, so it's great. That's why I kept coming back to it, to really solidify your understanding with all this, just as if you were reading a textbook over and over again to study for a test. To be fair, I think my initial reaction could have also been influenced by the fact that, the way he basically describes everything and does this is kind of in the style of, I guess, what you would call like online gaming, which is something that I'm really not familiar with at all. And it's still a very clever idea regardless that he was able to do all this, but, I didn't really at first understand what he was doing with all that, and it kind of made it hard to follow like some of the things. For instance, when he talks about chords being used in solo play, now I think I know what he means by it. At first, I didn't really know. I thought it could have meant, playing like solo by yourself or taking a solo, but now I'm pretty sure he means, playing on one chord at a time and just staying there, kind of like a modal type of thing. Nevertheless, after watching this a few more times and understanding it better and better, I could really appreciate what he did with all that, and I think it's a very good metaphor for what he's trying to say with all this. Now, in an overall sense, the main thing that I think is cool about this video is that it does a really good job at suggesting a deeper level of understanding when it comes to the study of these common yet fundamental chords we typically find in jazz that I would say is comparatively at the level of something like the study of classical counterpoint. In today's world, the idea of having chords in music has become so ubiquitous and standardized to the point where even your average non-musician, generally speaking, kind of already understands what chords are when it comes to music. But we have to remember that things obviously weren't like this, and before this was just, commonplace musical knowledge, all this stuff needed to be discovered and figured out. When talking about something like the history of harmony, before we ever had anything like these sort of standardized, chord types or labels that, we may say establishes a sort of, basic vocabulary of, harmonic collections, all we ever had in music, harmonically speaking, was counterpoint. And counterpoint is really what true harmony was and will always be anyway. And these, chord labels are just these sort of shorthands, even if they could be very effective, just kind of learn things in this sort of way and use them when applicable. The thing is, though, not that there's anything wrong with anyone, learning some basic chords and playing music with it or writing songs if you know how they work functionally. That's what we do today because we're fortunate enough to have people before us figure all this stuff out. But if you never actually went through, the process of learning true harmony and counterpoint and starting at a place of, foundation and as simple as possible, then you'll never really understand harmony on that deep level, regardless of what you're doing either way, because you never really studied, true voice leading or the motion between, all the individual voices in any given harmony. And in addition, I'm not an expert when it comes to this, historical point here, but I'm pretty sure the idea of having, a list of acquired, chords or like a vocabulary of harmonies, like I said before, is really more so coming out of the jazz tradition anyway. And I'm talking in generalities when I say this, but a lot of times, if you take a real classical musician, they could be studying, things that are very, harmonically complex or, four-part harmonies, and you might even label what might be going on with these harmonies, as implying different chords. But classical musicians a lot of times don't even necessarily think in this sort of way because, if they've studied, they just understand voice leading, on a more detailed level where it almost doesn't matter anyway because they know the way notes can move around. And, that's why me as a jazz musician, I used to do things like this where I would take a classical piece, like this is a Bach lute suite that I would work on, and, for no real reason, I would label, the harmonies that would be implied, above that, just to kind of see what's going on from a sort of chord progression sort of perspective, so I would know. So here's how I think Patrick's video relates to all this. There's a great video series on YouTube that I'm going to link part 1 of in the description. It's this guy who's teaching basic classical counterpoint, and part 1 starts with, the simplest foundation of one-to-one species counterpoint, just two voices moving at a time and, not different rhythms, or just all linked together. And like I said before, historically, people had to figure out all this stuff. So the absolute first place you could start with is figuring out, how could you move around just two notes as a minimum and have it harmonically sound good and what works. And you're really just dealing with one harmonic interval at a time. First one moving to another one and then another one, and you sort of learn like what are the rules, which intervals sound good, implying motion, or which ones are more stable, which ones aren't good at all. You learn all that stuff. So really quickly, just a little side thing for you to enjoy. I wrote a little, quick counterpoint that I varied rhythmically a little bit to make it a little bit more musical. This could be like a section for a song. This would be in the key of A flat, but this is basically like a, one-to-one species counterpoint. like that. It sounds very musical. But what I want to say about this is that, when this guy talks about how to do this stuff in his video, he talks about how intervals like thirds, tenths, and sixths, which are really all the same thing, because a third and a tenth is the same thing. It's just, spread over another octave, and a sixth is an inversion of a third. But those intervals he described kind of like motor oil, where he would say other sort of consonant intervals like, octaves, fifths, or whatever, are more like glue and stable, and they don't really, create a lot of easy motion. So if you're learning about counterpoint from a very fundamental, basic level like this, and you know these things, you're already establishing a knowledge of, how certain intervals harmonically can move from one to the other, and therefore, that may influence your choices in terms of what you want to compose and what will sound good. Now, as things get more complex, we can, evolve to the point of having things like four-part counterpoint or whatever. But if we look at now what Patrick is talking about in his video, to me, by creating this sort of tier list and little descriptions of all these basic harmonies and how they're used in, different situations, he's starting to establish in a very organized way a sort of collection of knowledge that we could apply to these sort of shorthand chords, like I said before, and know, how to use them effectively and what will work and what will, give us a lot of options and what won't. And it's like he said in his video, in free play, or whatever he called it, basically if you want to do whatever you want, all these chords could be valid. If it sounds good to you and you like what you're doing, that's what matters. But if we want to consider things like true harmony and all the individual voices and how they move, like a counterpoint, this stuff is going to be very helpful in terms of knowing, what options we may have at our disposal that will sound good. Okay, now I'm going to get into some specifics. So, as far as the actual tier list that Patrick created and how we rank these chords in a way that we could generally describe as being least useful, powerful, or effective to most, I suppose, largely speaking, I agree with a lot of what he really said here. I think there's a lot of accuracy in this. At first, the way he broke it up into certain categories and where the dividing lines may be between some of these categories, especially the middle ones, I thought was a little subjective or arbitrary, but the more I take a look at these categories, the more I could really understand them, and I think they really make sense. And if you look at all the chords in the usable limited function category, for instance, minor triad, dominant 13th, dominant 9, and major 7, those are cool, but then if you look at them comparatively to the chords in the category above, the solid support, multi-purpose, those chords are definitely, more frequently used in various chord progressions or common sequences of voicings that we find in jazz, like the major 7 sharp 11, the minor 11, the sus, the major triad, minor 7, etc. Right? And then if we look at the category below all of those, the situational, which only has the minor 13, that one, while it's a cool chord, he's right. It's definitely, less frequently used or has less options of how it could be applied within the context of a chord progression. Alright, so the first chord that I specifically want to highlight now is the half diminished chord, and this one to me was really interesting. I think that everything Patrick says about this chord in his video is generally good stuff. I would agree that we could give it the lowest ranking on the entire tier list and have it be the only chord at the bottom in the too weak by itself category. I'd say that it's almost the only chord that we have here that doesn't really work as a tonic chord or a chord that we can basically stay on without any support. And that's because, we also have a chord like the dominant 7 flat 9 that to me kind of has a similar thing going on with, alright? But with that chord, there's functionally a lot more options of things that we could do with it. That's why it's much more higher up on the list. And just as a side point on the dominant 7 flat 9, I also thought it was really great how Patrick mentioned, the difference between a dominant 7 flat 9 chord and a diminished 7th, because functionally speaking, if you understand your harmony, those two chords are pretty much identical. So say we took like a F7 flat 9 chord, like this stock shape, if you think of the diminished 7th that's related to this, it can have different roots, but we could say it's, F sharp diminished, or E flat diminished, C diminished, or A diminished, right? But let's just say we called the root C diminished, so we could see the similarities in these shapes, right? So the only difference is if we were going to see this as like a F7 flat 9 chord, the stock shape for that basically has no fifth. It's like root, it has a third, a seventh, and a flat 9. Alright, but the diminished seventh basically takes that root out and replaces it with what would be the fifth of F7 flat 9, alright? And neither one of those tones, the root or the fifth, really affect the tonality, but at the specific level of voicings, there's a difference there, and the way those notes can move to other notes obviously is going to be affected. So that's also a great point that he brought up. But the options for what we could do with a half diminished chord are pretty limited, like he mentioned, to really only being a 2 chord in a minor key. So basically, if we're in B minor or B flat minor, C half diminished is a 2 chord, F7 to B flat minor, right? I will say though, and I know this is something that Patrick knows, but I also like the sound of the minor 2-5 progression resolving to a major tonic instead. So something like, I think this still sounds good. I think the voice leading is fine, and it gives us more of a deceptive cadence, or basically like a false resolution to a major instead. Either way, all they really are just slight harmonic variations on the same basic 2-5-1 progression that would be in the same tonal center, whether it be a major key or a minor key. It was also a great point that he made about how the major 7 sharp 11 chord also can help really validate the half diminished chord and, give it more places to move, a la, Joe Henderson, Inner Urge, right? So the way that he kind of established that was great. Now, given the realities of this chord, the fact that we could establish that its potential function or use is pretty limited is pretty interesting to me as a guitarist, because regardless of this, the stock shapes themselves for half diminished chords on the guitar actually turn out to be very practical and can be used in a lot of different ways if you know how. So just to show you some common things, I could take this, what you might think is a E half diminished chord, but I could see that as like a C7 chord, like a rootless C9 shape, right? Let's say I was going to use this like a 2 chord, like an E half diminished. That's the proper function there, but it's very common on the guitar to take this shape and move it up a minor third and use that as like your 5 chord in like a minor 2-5-1 in D minor. And if we were going to analyze this as a 5 chord in D minor, so like some sort of A7, that's the flat 7, that's the third, that's the sharp 5, and that's the flat 9. So it's basically like an A7 flat 9 with the sharp 5 as well. So it's a totally valid altered, dominant 5 chord that can go to D minor, right? But it's very practical to just take that shape and know that you can move it up a minor third. Another common things that you could do with that would be to take one voice and move it around. So stuff like where you can, suspend it to the 9, right? So that's all great stuff. Another really great idea that I basically stole from Wes, and this kind of relates to what I was saying before with the major 7 sharp 11. So if you kind of take some of these concepts, he has a way of playing a 2-5-1, so this would be in the key of F. So for his 2 chord, he's basically playing what you would think is a F half diminished chord, but I'm using it the way I just described. It's like a G7 chord, like a 2-7 in the key of F. So it'd be like a G7 flat 9 sharp 5, and then from there he goes to this chord, which you might think is E major 7 sharp 11, but I'm using this as a C7, which will give you like a C altered sound. It's got the third, the flat 7, the sharp 9, sharp 5, and then for the 1 for the resolution, I'm playing F7 sharp 9, and a great sequence of voicings, right? So these are all different, really common and practical and great sounding ways that we could actually use this as a shape, regardless of the fact that its function as a half diminished chord itself is kind of limited. Now, another common application of this half diminished chord, which leads me to my next point, is that we can label this exact same chord as being a minor 6 chord instead, and just labeling a different note in the chord as being the root. So, for example, an E half diminished, where E minor 7 flat 5 chord is literally identical to a G minor 6 chord, as they contain the exact same notes. We just label E as the root in this one and G is the root in this one, alright? But keep in mind that we can use this chord in both of these ways regardless of what inversion we may have or what voicing we're using. Even though we're choosing to label the chord differently, it's still, on a certain level, the same sound. And yet, the half diminished chord doesn't really work as a stable tonic sound. And on the contrary, the minor 6 chord as a specific variation on a basic minor tonality actually works really good as a tonic sound for minor, right? So we all kind of are used to hearing that. If I have like a a minor 2-5 in the key of G, A half diminished, D7, and then I land on a G minor 6. And isn't this also interesting because Patrick talks about like with the minor 13 chord like not giving away that third of the next chord, but the minor 6, it's like a Dorian sound. It works good as a tonic, but you wouldn't want to use that as like a 2 chord. So like you wouldn't play like, say you had a 2-5-1 in G major, you wouldn't want to play A minor 6 because it's giving that note away already. But here, because we haven't given it away, this chord works good as a tonic sound. Now, while I can speculate, I can't really say that I know exactly why Patrick didn't include any 6 chords on his list here. But it is interesting to notice since I don't think any real jazz musician would deny their legitimate place amongst, the current meta of jazz harmony as he describes. Just ask any disciple of Barry Harris what they think of this. To me, the thing that makes 6 chords special is that they're always also just an inversion of a perhaps more standard 7th chord. So, for instance, the one that we just looked at, the minor 6 chord is really just an inversion of a minor 7 flat 5, okay? We could say that a major 6 chord, which is also common, is really just an inversion of a minor 7 chord, alright? And then this next one isn't really used as much, but we can also say that a minor flat 6 chord is really just an inversion of a major 7 chord, okay? This is kind of an arbitrary point, but when we consider the common nomenclature for different chord types, the add 9 chord, the add 11 chord, and 6 chords are all similar in that their construction involves some sort of triad, a 1-3-5, plus an upper extension, which would be like a 2 or a 9, or a 4 or 11, or a 6 or 13. But it also specifically doesn't contain any kind of 7th, because if it did, we would label the chord as something else. So why do we call 2 of these chords add 9 and add 11, and call the other one simply just 6 chords instead of something like an add 6 or whatever? I can only speculate, but maybe it's because with the 2 and the 9, or the 4 and 11, that extra extension note basically falls in the middle of the triad. We have like a 1-3-5, the 2 would be in the middle of that, and so would the 4. But the 6 numerically is falling, on the outside of the triad, and because of that unique construction, like I said before, we also basically create just an inversion of another 7th chord. It's just something I think that's interesting to note. To me, because the major 6 chord and the minor 6 chord are really just inversions of 2 other chords that are on this list, Patrick may have thought that it might be redundant to include them again. Because if they have the same exact notes, the way that they may potentially be able to voice lead, functionally speaking, will probably be similar. And I thought it was good that Patrick pointed out how good of a chord the basic minor 7 chord is, and when we can see that it's really just an inversion of a major 6 chord, it really makes sense, since the major 6 chord also is a pretty well-balanced sounding chord. And inevitably, the minor 7 chord was higher up on his list than something like the major 7 chord, which, he said sounds good, is kind of usable, but not as much. And remember, a major 7 chord, if we turn that into a 6 chord like I did before, it would just be like a minor flat 6, right? But the minor 7 chord, it works good as a 2 leading into the dominant. Let's say I have something like F major 7, like that's my basic sound. I could play a minor 7 to give me that, major 9 type sound, or I could play like D minor 7, which is basically just your F major 6 sound, right? So this chord is used all the time when it comes to playing jazz guitar. What all this stuff that I'm saying here really comes down to is that for me as a guitarist, and I think a lot of other guitarists can relate, I think the way that we can typically learn, understand, and utilize harmony could be really significantly impacted by the nature of the instrument that we play. Because from the very beginning, whenever we learn chords, not only are we just learning about what that chord is on a musically fundamental level that is, kind of extracted from just being on the guitar, but we're also learning a specific shape. Like if we take E major, like this basic chord, we might learn that it's an E major chord and a little bit about how to use it in a progression, and that's what it is. But in the beginning, probably more importantly, you learn about how it's a shape, and then once it becomes a bar chord, then physically it really becomes a shape that you can move around, and then maybe you learn a little bit about harmony. So you may think something like, all right, well, if I want E minor, I can just think relative major, like G major. So I have that shape, and I'm kind of using it like that, right? So you're still thinking in a very shape-based way, and the guitar, like I always say, is a very shape-based instrument. That's my whole point. So I think this really affects the way that we could see harmony and certain chords and voicings and how we may be able to use them. And this is another reason why I really have to hand it to Patrick for his video and what he's able to communicate in his video, because I don't know him personally, so I don't know what other instruments he may possibly play, even if a little bit, if he plays any guitar or piano. I think the stuff that he knows and his knowledge is what I would expect him to know anyway for a musician of his caliber. I think any capable professional jazz musician is fluent with this harmony, regardless of what they may play. But I know for me, as a guitar player, the visual element to how chord voicings or fingerings are can really have an influence on, what I can see in terms of possibilities of what I could do with them. Like, for example, when he was talking about the sus chord, it's really interesting to me that he called it the Tetris chord, because I've always kind of thought the same way about this sort of stock dominant 7 suspended shape. It's just like literally like the vertical straight line brick in Tetris, and because it looks like that structurally, at least in my opinion, it's easy to understand how you can kind of like move that around indefinitely until you resolve it to third, like he said. But it makes sense. Like I've always thought that way about sus, how it's a very stable dominant chord that you could stay on if you want, but can also easily be moved around in that fashion because of its structure. But when you look at what that voicing looks like on guitar, it kind of makes sense. Another quick example of how the visual component of various chord shapes can really help to illuminate the possibilities of what we could do, perhaps now within the context of a chord progression, would be we could take a chord like a minor 11 chord, and this is basically like the so what voicing, but without that, just up to the minor third there, alright? And this is so close of a shape to the sus chord that we just looked at anyway, but this is also very comfortable and practical on the guitar. So if we see we got 3 in a row on the same fret that are all barred, and kind of this one is independent, we can very easily move this around to do something like this, alright? It gives you a pretty modern sound, and functionally, we could look at this perhaps as like a 3-6-2-5, like in the key of B flat. This would be like your D minor 11. This would be technically the tritone sub. It would be like a D flat 11. It's got the third and the 11 in it, so it's not suspended. And then we do the same thing on the 2 and the 5. C minor 11 and B 11 technically, alright? But because it looks so clear visually as an idea on the guitar, it's really easy to kind of think about an idea like that without even having to think about the complex harmony of, oh, I'm using tritone sub and I'm being extra hip because I'm putting the 11 in there. You don't even need to think about that. You can analyze after the fact. But then if you go back to something like the half diminished chord and what I was talking about before, and we consider this element of like the shape or how it might be used, I guess that's why it's really interesting to me that it was all the way at the bottom, because yes, it's a half diminished chord and how it's functioning in that sort of standard way, I agree, but there's so many things that you could do with this shape on guitar. And even if you're soloing, you know, that half diminished or minor 7 flat 5 arpeggio, even if you're not using it over that same chord, I find to be very useful for a lot of different ideas, you know. Anyway, I'm going to start to go through some more quick points and try to wrap up this now. So, some other things that I liked. Obviously, I agree that the regular dominant 7 should be at the top. It's good to know that because, you know, in terms of functionality, like he's talking about, sometimes extra notes can kind of hurt your comp and make it harder to move around. And just having even like the 3rd and 7th, it's all you need. And if you can appreciate harmony in terms of context within a progression from that perspective, it kind of makes you appreciate that sound on a deeper level. Because a lot of times, I think, you know, more beginners, when they're learning about different chords and harmony, they kind of think like the basic chords aren't as cool, like regular dominant 7s or even like a major chord like he talked about. But if you know how to use it, it could sound great, obviously, in context. I like how he mentioned, you know, using the regular dominant 7 on the tritone, obviously, was great. It gives you, you know, all the good notes that you want, plus the same functional 3rd and 7s. Another one like this that he mentioned is the basic major triad. I think that because it's a very fundamental basic chord that people will usually learn when they first start learning music, they may not think it sounds cool by itself, and we can understand where they're coming from, but if you understand how to use it in context properly, it could still be a very powerful sound. You know, like if I have like a E flat 7 chord, you know, I could play like a shell like that, but then this is just an E flat triad, you know. It's good for voice leading, or to use it is like a 2 chord, because diatonically the 2 would be minor or minor 7, but if I'm in like B flat, for example, you know, if I play like a C major triad to F7, you know, kind of throws you for a loop a little bit. Sound kind of cool in that context. Anyway, this video is starting to get a little too long for me, so this is what I'm going to do. In the next episode,
Hope you're ready for the next episode. Hey.
I'm going to break down my comping example that I played for you guys in the last video that I just put out, even though a lot of people haven't really checked it out yet, but that was something that I came up with when I was thinking about a lot of the things from Patrick's video, and I think by breaking this down, it can really help further demonstrate how everything that he's saying can actually really be useful in application, because in this example, it's 2 choruses of a jazz blues, and for pretty much all of it, I'm playing a different chord or voicing on every single quarter note throughout the whole thing, and that can be difficult to do for a guitar player sometimes. You know, how do you create motion within the harmony without moving away from the harmony, if that makes sense? And one of the things he was talking about was how useful the regular dominant 7 chord and the diminished 7 chord, for example, really could be. And the majority of stuff in this example is just comprised of the basic, you know, dominant 7 shell voicings and diminished 7 shell voicings. And there's some other stuff in there too that works in context, and you'll see all that. But in my opinion, this is one of the best things that you can do to really learn and understand all this stuff. It's good to intellectualize all the theory and harmony and understand why all this works, but unless you actually see or discover, you know, how this stuff is being used in context and why it sounds good, it could be hard to figure out how to use all this stuff, all right? So you'll see, you know, within this comp what the majority of it is, and how I'm making very basic chords actually sound pretty sophisticated, you know, in context, you know, moving from one voicing to another, all right? So that's all I'll say on that for now. But we'll just leave it here today because this was definitely a lot. I also just want to say on a personal level to Patrick, thank you so much for your video. I definitely enjoyed it and obviously got a lot out of it. I think your content is really helping out a lot of young, aspiring jazz musicians, and I appreciate all you do for the jazz community and how you do it, and of course your style and how you play. You're the man, so thanks again. So if you enjoyed this video, I would really appreciate it if you gave it a like and consider becoming a subscriber as well as a contributor to Patreon, where you can get all the PDFs that are on this channel for only $5 a month. If you think anyone else would enjoy this channel, please share it with them as well, and I will see you guys in episode 84.
Swinging and playing the blues. That's what we about.
I try to help you.